Hello everybody and welcome back to another exciting edition of Boyographic, the show in which I, Matt, the Game Boy, will talk you through the highs and lows of the Game Boy library, one card at a time. This week we'll be kicking off yet another year of Japanuary, where I look at some of the best games that never graced Western shores. First up, it's Kaeru no Tame ni Kane wa Naru, also known as The Frog for Whom the Bell Tolls. It's fair to say that on almost every one of their consoles, Nintendo has left the Western world a little saddened by not releasing at least one major first-party game for each of them. I've heard many an internet message board weep over the lack of localization of Famicom Fire Emblem games, titles like Custom Robo and Sin and Punishment on the N64, not to mention Mother 3 on the Game Boy Advance. There is one such title on the Nintendo Game Boy that is almost never on any of these lists, however, and that is Kaeru no Tame ni Kane wa Naru, commonly referred to here in the West as The Frog for Whom the Bell Tolls. The title, of course, is a play on Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, and not a Metallica song. Therefore, it shouldn't surprise you to hear that when a game decides to parody the title of one of the 20th century's greatest authors' works, said game is probably going to be a little text-heavy, causing some trouble to anyone who doesn't speak Japanese. Fortunately, as with Mother 3, there is hope, dear viewers. Thankfully, some incredibly talented folks over at romhacking.net translated the game to make it playable for the likes of you and I. A huge thank you to Ryan BGSTL, Aini Hen, B Diker, Demonanens, and Artemis251 for their work on translating this, as to put the cart before the horse, their unofficial translation of this game is probably better than anything we'd have gotten if the game had officially come out. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. For The Frog the Bell Tolls, as the translation calls the game, is actually an action RPG that opens with two rivals, the Prince of Custard and the Prince of Sable, locked in a friendly duel. Two men matched in looks, wits, but unfortunately for the Prince of Sable, not in combat. This is the game's protagonist, the unnamed Prince of Sable. Your rival is named Richard. It's during this duel that both princes hear that Princess Tiramisu of the Milfoil Kingdom has been captured by the evil King Delarin and his Crokian army. The princes both rush off to save her, and so begins our tale of adventure. From the off, it might appear to you like a traditional action JRPG, what with a princess in distress and a clumsy protagonist, but don't be fooled. If anything, Frog Bell is a parody of the genre that fashions itself closer to an adventure game when it roleplays, and in between its story beats, plays like an experiment with what both a role-playing game as well as the Game Boy were capable of. The game for the most part takes place in a top-down perspective as you wander around the overworld map and numerous towns dotted around it, inhabited by beautiful sprites and the kind of quirky characters you'd expect from such an early Nintendo game. These towns naturally serve as a place to buy shields and items, not to mention giving you valuable information you'll need to progress. The game's various dungeons are where most of Frog Bell's gameplay happens, however, and you'll perhaps be surprised to realise that at this point, the game becomes a side-scrolling platformer. Combat isn't conducted by jumping on enemies' heads or by slashing them, however, but on contact, you and the enemy will roll around in a cartoony tussle. The victor of the battle and how much HP you lose isn't determined by random button presses, but by the prince's stats and equipment. In the case of regular enemies, you can generally defeat most of what the game's dungeons throw at you. Where the adventure game angle I was aiming at, however, is that certain bosses around the dungeons cannot be beaten without getting the prince's health, strength, defense, and speed to a required level. Unlike, say, a Zelda game, which you've undoubtedly noticed there are some similarities to by now, there are no optional hearts here, much like every shield, sword, Power Star or Speed Moon that can be collected in each of the game's dungeons must be, as the game gates your progression by obtaining these items. You'll generally only just make it out of most boss encounters with a heart to spare, but this does cheapen the game's combat a little. The game tries to rectify this in later boss battles by having you hit certain parts of larger bosses, but there is also an option if you get in over your head to click the B button and try and run away from combat or use an item to heal yourself. To give Nintendo credit where it's due, however, this is an incredibly unique take on an automated battle system that often rewards avoiding rather than battling enemies, encouraging you to improve your platforming prowess, as that's generally where the gameplay is. Well, as much as the game will let you improve, that is. Despite the great early examples of Nintendo's side-scrolling expertise on the system, Frog Bell isn't the best example of a solid platformer. There's a little bit of floatiness to the Prince's jump that means later dungeons full of spikes, traps, and even instant death pools that will see your health chipped away entirely will generally cause a bit of an issue. While there are orbs placed around the game to try and balance out this aspect and heal players generally before boss battles, if you don't manage to make it to one, death in a dungeon will see you teleported back to the hospital of the last town you visited, which can leave you feeling really sour if you were right at the end of a dungeon, as you're not only going to have to get back there, but traverse the whole damn thing again. Fortunately, this game isn't so harsh as to make you need to recollect your items you gained in that dungeon, which is a sigh of relief from me. So, I hear you ask the question, dear viewers, where do the frogs come in? Well, actually pretty early on in the story, and as the title may suggest, form one of the main focuses of your quest. After reaching the land of Milfeu and attempting to find Richard and the princess, our prince stumbles across a witch called Madola, who tricks him into eating a fruit she tells him will give him the strength to beat Delarin, only it turns him into a frog. As both princes are matched in wits, it turned out Richard did the same and convinced his army to do likewise. After confronting Madola again, she sells the prince another potion, this one allowing him to turn back into a human unless he comes into contact with water. This is a little Ranma half-esque, it has to be said, but this ability to switch between man and frog becomes a key mechanic in the game's dungeons. Madola also informs the player that until the great bell rings for spring, the spell will not be lifted from the prince, Richard, or any of the other frogs. Well, you're able to battle with the best of them as a human, as I've already said. Victory here is all in the platforming, so it's just as well that getting wet and becoming a frog allows you to jump higher, survive underwater, and eat insectoid enemies to restore your health. Later in the game, by eating a snake's egg, the prince will also gain the ability to become a snake, allowing the player to crawl on their belly into tight gaps and climb to areas inaccessible to the prince through other means. It's a neat little idea that offers some variety to the game, as well as some light puzzle elements in the platforming. By eating eggs to become a snake, or an apple to switch you back to the prince, there's a small degree of inventory management to be done with these consumables, which would perhaps be a little punishing to those resorting to trial and error to beat certain sections. They can, however, be bought in the game's store along with wine, which is the game's potion equivalent, at a very low cost. So if you'd prefer to grind on enemies for the game's not currency, you definitely can do so. Another great little idea of this game's transformation mechanic is not only will certain enemies not attack you as a snake or a frog, but you'll actually be able to communicate with the frogs and a large majority of the game's enemies to learn helpful hints about the game, but also some little story beats here and there that really help flesh out Frog Bell's world. The game's graphics, as you already will have noticed, have an incredible charm to them, and its music is second to none, which, in all fairness, should never be questioned, as it's the work of Kazumi Totaka, and yes, it does contain a version of Totaka's theme, if you should choose to find it. What's most interesting about this game, though, is that it's the work of Nintendo's famous R&D1 and Intelligent Systems, with Yoshi Sakamoto writing the game's story, and Toru Osawa directing it. I say this is a surprise because the game's engine would go on to become the basis for another Game Boy title, which, if you haven't already guessed by now, was called The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. The way the screens transition, the 2D platforming segments, and the game's general aesthetics all come from Frog Bell. And yet the only acknowledgement of this Western gamers ever saw without even knowing it was Prince Richard, sat in a room full of frogs, pleading for Link to help him get his castle back. Frog Bell was released in 1992, when Link's Awakening was released almost a full year later in 1993. And strangely, the only common link in the credits between these games is some of Totaka's music. It's safe to say that without Frog Bell, there would almost certainly not be a Link's Awakening, at least in the format we know it. In the Iwata's asks on the handheld Zelda series, the team that created Link's Awakening stated that their project began almost as an after-school club. Takashi Tezuka, the game's director, says he was officially asked to start developing a Game Boy Zelda title in 1991 after completing A Link to the Past. At the time, Tezuka says, the team was almost trying to transplant A Link to the Past to the Game Boy. Now, we all know the stories that these two games link together, but other than that, the gameplay is more reminiscent of the first two Zelda titles on the NES. Unfortunately, Tezuka neither elaborates on this idea or mentions Frog Bell during the entire discussion, but given the notion that this finished game doesn't represent A Link to the Past as closely as it could have, was Frog Bell nothing more than a proto-Zelda game? Or was the reason it never saw a Western release due to the fact that Tezuka's team simply rebuilt the game from the ground up in order to get a Zelda title out the door faster? Unfortunately, as this game has to this day never been officially localised, we may never know the answer. Frog Bell's only references in modern Nintendo are the stickers and assist trophies that appear in the Smash Bros. Games, as well as Dr. Awostein, the Nintendo employee in the game, showing up in Wario Land 4. It's a very sad state of affairs for a game that is actually still very popular with Japanese gamers, who not only experienced the game the first time around, but also got to relive the magic again when the game was re-released for the Nintendo 3DS eShop. It's also worth noting that there was also once talk of a Game Boy Color update for Frog Bell, similar to Link's Awakening DX, but as nothing has ever surfaced of such an updated version, who's to say that we would have ever seen that one either? Fortunately for us though, a team at romhacking.net is also seeing that this unofficially happens. At the end of the day, it's always hard to say how true a fan translation is when you can't understand the original language. But for me, for the Frog, the Bell Tolls will always stand out as a game I'm sad never saw any official Western release. Its writing is magical, its ideas, while hindsight has taught us aren't perhaps the best approach to making a side-scrolling action RPG, are at least still unique to this title. Top it off with a beautiful score, stunning visuals, and a battery save, and it's hard to see why you wouldn't like this game if you love a good story. It's not a long game by any stretch of the imagination. I think I beat it in 5 to 6 hours. But the time I shared with Kare no Tame ni Kane ni Waru will stay with me for a long time. Its quirky nature to me is at least reminiscent of the feeling I get while playing anything in the Mother series, and honestly stands up as perhaps the best story of any Game Boy game I've had the pleasure of playing. It's an impressive little game that, while not perfect, really is a shame that we never got to play it way back when. And while I won't talk to you about the legality of playing a fan-translated title almost 25 years after the game came out, if you're able to read Japanese, do be sure to grab a cart or a digital version from the eShop, as I guarantee that even a quarter of a century later, this bell still rings true. And that brings us to the end of another slightly longer Boyographic, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed regardless. If you have, then why not check out some more of our Boyographic videos, where I look at the highs and lows of the Game Boy library, one cart at a time. For the rest of the month, I will also be covering some Japanese-only titles that are sure to inspire your next Game Boy purchase, so why not click that subscribe button, or share this with some people you think might be interested, as that's how the channel gets around. You can also check out some of our Boy Curious videos, where I look at bootlegs and oddities for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, as well as our All the Glory videos, where I play through a game cutting out all the deaths, leaving you with none of the faff, but all the glory. Until next week at Game Boys and Girls, where I will be back with another Japanese title, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Gameboy, as well as on Twitter. Until then though, be sure to let me know what you think of the game in the comments down below, and game on.